development of fun-scale models. This series is focusing on building the fun-scale Parked Flyer P-40C Tomahawk. In this episode, we'll be continuing construction on the wing. So we're going to start working on the outer right panel. I want to pen the leading edge in place first. To help keep it, making sure that it's exactly straight and true, I'm going to go ahead and use this ruler to sort of help me keep it that way. So I'm just penning it in place now, making sure that I'm right on that line. I'm just a little bit over. That's good. Okay, I'm going to put another pin here at the leading edge, the most inbound section, and push it right up against that. Then I'll just use some additional T-pins to hold this in place, using the T part of the pin to keep it where I want it. And just sort of making sure I'm pushing up against this ruler. Keep it nice, straight, and true. Pinning it down also makes sure that it stays flat with your board. And go ahead and remove these push pins and the ruler and add just a couple on the front side. I like to go the area opposite. And I am putting them in at a slight angle, and that's because of the length of the pin. It'll hit the table underneath if you don't put it at a slight angle. There we go. Next, we're going to work on the trailing edge parts. I'm going to put this pin right here. That is the guide point of the furthest more that T2 goes. So go ahead and I'm going to line that up. I'm just going to set a bit of weight on it right now to keep it from sliding around. This is T2A, and we need to glue that in place next. So using a guideline, go ahead and add a couple of drops in there, just to hold it in place while we can remove it from the board and give it a good gluing. It could stick a little bit, so. Okay. Go ahead and I'll glue it here. Small little rip in the film covering here. We'll go ahead and put tape over that. We need to assemble the washout jig. That's these three pieces here. Go ahead and we'll stack them up. Make sure that they're flush there. And I'll lay them flat. Just put a couple of drops of glue. Add some more glues to it just to finish it off. We'll let that dry. So I've pinned the washout jig in place over the plans. Next thing I'm going to do is protect it with some clear tape. This will also help hold it to the board, but prevent the CA from sticking to it. And what we'll be doing eventually is pinning that up. So what this does is it automatically builds the washout into the wing. So we're going to use pins for alignment. These pins go in the space between stringer number 4 and TE2A. I'm going to add a couple along the way here. One more right here. I'm also going to add one between the two parts there. What this allows us to do is go ahead and set the piece in place here. We can check its alignment by using W8. That looks good. So we're getting closer to being ready to start gluing parts here together. This forward stringer, stringer number 1, is pinned in place. I've made sure that it's flush with this outside edge. We've put tape over the wing washout jig. We've put pins to mark the separation between the stringers and the trailing edge pieces. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this part here called TAG, or tip angle guide, and glue it very lightly against the bottom of this part, which is the tip part. Just going to make sure that I'm not going to run into anything. Just tacking it on. Don't really want it thoroughly glued. We're going to remove this later, but the P40's wingtips angled up as such. So just sort of set that in place for right now. We'll go ahead and we'll add this in place here. Sort of push it up against the parts. And so I'm pressing against that TAG part, pushing against the stringer, and I'm also sort of pushing this piece here flat against the washout jig. So I'm going to glue that corner, glue the leading edge, give that a moment to set up. I am going to pin here. So I'm pinning to the inside of W6. We also need to make sure that we're keeping this flush against the washout jig. So next we're going to put in W8. Sure that we're 90 degrees. I'm pushing that up against TE3. When I'm happy with it, I'm going to drop it, drop some glue in place. That's it for a minute. So what we've done is we've glued this assembly to this, W8 to this, and this piece here. But what we haven't done, and it's sort of tough to see in the camera, is there's a space here. And the reason for that space is this is where we cut the aileron free later. I'm going to slide in place the other stringers. We'll leave those for right now, and we're going to grab W7 and W6 next. I've set W6 and W7 in place. One thing I do want to do is to make sure that this corner here of TE2A stays pressed against the washout jig. So I am going to add a pin there to help hold it in place. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to glue W6 in place before W7, and here's why. Between here and here is where the washout happens. This is flat on the board. This has 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees of washout. W7 sort of floats in the middle here. So what we'll want to do is we'll want to lock in this spot and this spot. And where the natural progression of the stringers goes is how this piece will be glued in place. So with this set up, and it's pushing up against that pin there, and pushing against the board, and again up here. While that's drying, we're going to finalize our alignment of this here. So we'll want to make sure that these two stringers, stringers 1 and 2, are flush against the ground. 3 and 4 are going to float slightly. So I'll go ahead and I'll glue in the front there. These last two, I'm not pushing down in the back, I'm letting them naturally progress to the right height above the table. And I'll add these other stringers here. The last piece that we need to add in this area is ALE. So this was one of the hand cut parts from before. So this stops before these two here. So as you can see, I need to adjust the alignment slightly. And it's still a little long, so I'm going to trim just a little bit more. I'm just sanding the edge here. Okay, that looks good. We'll fine tune the rest. So I'm checking to make sure in alignment. Again, sort of pushing down to make sure that that corner is against the washout jig. Alright, so that's the aileron leading edge in place. We'll add, per the plans, some additional stringers later. And now we'll add in W5, be adding our W3 assembly. This one got just a little bit off, so we're going to go ahead and correct for that. And the last one we'll do is W2. So we're going to, just outside the line, put in our pins as guides. Then we can use our W2 angle guide. To set it on the model. And this seems to have moved inboard, so we can come on out to the pins. Check. That looks good. And just work our way back. Okay, we'll go ahead and we'll let that dry. So we have all of our ribs glued in place. I've added this 1/16 sheet balsa plate here. This is going to be the plate for the servo. Servos will actually be glued in place. You want to make sure that you've tested them thoroughly before you get to this point. Now, one thing I've noticed with this particular servo, it's a 4.3 gram. It's just a little bit too thick. Even if I were to put 3/32 instead of 1/16, there wouldn't be enough clearance between the stringers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sand down these stringers here to match the 1/16. My bigger sanding block really doesn't get in there, so I made this smaller one here. I'm just going to sand it carefully so that the stringers match and are flush with the plate. Still a little bit more to do on this end. Okay, so now that can lie a little bit more flat and be clear. We'll probably have to do a little bit of sanding on the top side for this as well. So we've sanded down the stringers to be flush with our 1/16 balsa plate. We've prepped our servo in a couple ways. First would be we've got the control horn on, and I've tested this servo thoroughly. I also moved it once this control horn was centered. I carefully moved it to this point. That way it can lay flat on the surface. The other thing I did is I removed the stickers for the servo and replaced it with masking tape. That's going to give us a much more firm gluing surface. What I want to do is I'm going to make sure as much as possible that the servo is flush against this rib here, and that this center point of the servo is pretty much centered between these two stringers. I also added a small sub piece of stringer here to sort of box in this. When we complete the covering, this section will be cut out for the control horn. So we'll go ahead and we'll glue this in place. The other thing that I did was, using a small file, I carefully sanded down this notch. And what I'll be doing is, before I glue in this stringer, I'll be feeding the servo wire through that spot. Ready to add the remaining 4 top stringers. As you can see here, the intention was some of the stringers are going to overhang and be attached to TE3 here. So what I've done is I've pre-beveled the tip. They're more than likely not going to go all the way out to the tip here, and this will get sanded down as well. But you want to try and go out to the point where it's level across here. So that looks about it right there. We're going to set these in place. Again, we're using these pins here for spacer. That looks good. And we'll go ahead and we'll glue this in place. You're ready, so I'm going to sort of set this in place there. Pre-angled. Sort of just push this out so you see it start to rise above, so we want to make sure it's seated there. Trim that off. So adding in this number 2 stringer here, you can see there's a slight little bit of a gap right there. Not that big of a deal. I'm going to use some of the scrap that I had from when I trimmed up the angle on the tips and just sort of stick it in there. And maybe trim it just a little bit so that it's a snugger fit. Glue. We'll let that dry, we'll trim it off, sand it flush, and you'll never even know. So we finished adding all of our top stringers. We have our servo mounted. One of the last things we have left to do on this wing panel before we move it from the board is to add in the false aileron ribs. Now, looking at the other side of the plan, I made myself a little bit of a template here from a scrap stringer. Where these little marks are where the servo or the aileron ribs would be. So I'm going to go ahead and sort of set it in place here and mark the aileron. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some of my scrap that I had left over from the hatch rails to make the blanks for this. So here, I'm going to start with this sub rib, the one for W7. I've have the angle sanded here, and I'm going to mark it for its length. Now I don't want to go to the furthest point of the trailing edge. I want to come back a little bit so that it matches these other two ribs. Go ahead and I'll cut this to length. Again, checking how that fits. That looks to be good. The next thing I need to do is need to set for the height. So I'll just use that. Transfer the mark, and I'll trim it down to that line right there. That looks pretty good. I could probably take a little bit off the top. Making sure as much as I can that's in alignment with W7, and I'll glue it in place. So we'll do the same for these, and then we'll talk about the two end pieces. We've got our three sub ribs in place here. Once we remove the wing from the board, of course, we'll do our final sanding of it, but we have to do the two root and tip. So we're going to use the pins that we've had in here as a guide, and I'm going to do one little last bit of fine tuning. We want to, as much as possible, parallel this sub rib with W6 here. There we go. We'll do the same for this one here. So I've added all these sub ribs and I've removed the pins, and now I'm going to sand the rough blending into the rest of the wing here. What I'm doing is I'm just knocking the tops down so that it's flush with the leading edge. I'm also going to put pins in a couple of spots, and that is to keep these two pieces from becoming uneven. We'll later remove this before covering. I'm going to do one more here and one here. So I've removed the wing panel from the board and just given it a good looking over. Overall, very happy with how it turned out. No major items to be cleaning up and fixing. This will remove in just a few moments here. One thing I did notice is, if you can look right there, you can see there's a small gap between the rib and the leading edge, and that can sometimes happen. It's not a big thing to fix. What we'll do is we'll grab some 3/32 scrap here, and we'll go ahead and we'll cut a thin slice. This might not be thin enough. We'll go ahead and we'll slide it in place. You can see it there. I'll add some glue to that, and then we'll prep the wing to start shaping the leading edge.